We're on air. All right. TL 702, how we doing? It's been a while. We're back though. For those of you that don't remember me, I am Sean Lazarus, and then with me, go ahead. You guys want to introduce yourselves
Hi, I'm Liz Azukis, coming to you from New Jersey.
And Michelle Dwightley in Utah.
in Utah, and I'm coming from great state of New York. Anyway, I wanted to start off our discussion here on Module 9, which is on democracy in education, looking at families and students, on the Parent Power video, which I found to be very interesting, but at the same time, I had my own little quandary with it, if you want to say that. Just based off my own experiences as a teacher within the New York City Department of Education system. Most of you know my story as far as being a teacher at a high school in Manhattan. But I don't really put out there much about my experience teaching, my first year teaching in a middle school in the South Bronx. I actually know about some of these protests that had gone on and still go on. And I like to say that the video paints a very, what's the word I'm looking for, rosy tone to the way that the protests put the parents out to be like these people that are just fighting for their students' rights, and they're fighting for an a more equalized education. Yet from a teacher's perspective, on a day-to-day basis, they are non-existent. And I don't mean to come out that hard, but it's frustrating to see a video like that where it's depicting them as fighting so hard for their children's education, yet when it comes to trying to give them updates about their students' academic progress, it's almost impossible to. And this is my experience from when I worked in the South Bronx. Almost impossible to get them into the school, number one, for a meeting, two, on the phone. And that's obviously a variety of reasons, and that also plays into the whole issues within communities and having opportunities available to get the parents in. But even from where I am now, which is one of the better high schools in Manhattan, I still have problems getting in contact with parents. I think I was sharing with the group before. Last year during one of the parent-teacher conferences, I saw in a 4-hour time block, I saw 4 parents. I teaching high school juniors and seniors, I would think you would see more than 4 parents, but I guess not. So that's just my own point of view with it. That the video is very much a look what's going on, look what we need to fight for, but yet it fails to discuss the other side. So now I'm going to shut up and let the other two kind of talk a little bit.
I thought that video was very interesting because it spanned a pretty long period of time if you looked at the beginning to the end. But for part of that, I was actually there working for the New York City Public Schools in the central office. And for the protests where they were outside talking about the standardized tests, I think it had to do with the rollout of primarily the PARCC assessment and the fear that their students were not going to do well, and that was going to be the sole source of looking at their progress and those types of things. And that protest that occurred outside of Tweed, of the central office for New York City Public Schools, I actually had meetings there that day, and I had to cross the picket line to get into the building, which was very it was uncomfortable. It was very charged outside, and then it was very surreal inside because, like, for most people, it was just business as usual. Like, we're trying to have these meetings, and everyone's like, speak louder, because their chanting and their screaming into the bullhorns was so loud that they were almost successful in disrupting the work. And I just remember having this very surreal, like, feeling because they were trying to run meetings, some of which were about Common Core and PARCC, and they were just asking people to talk louder to try to drown out the protesters. And I remember thinking, like, should we be concerned? Like, should we be asking, like, what what it is they want, or should we have a better understanding of what they're talking about? And absolutely no one, including very high level people that I was in meetings with, seemed to even care that they were protesting outside. And I just remember feeling really, like, strange about it.
Because, I mean, what are they what are they going to do? Because I think in the videos that we watched for the protests at Mizzou, even a hunger strike wasn't enough to get people to do something, right? It took days and kind of more publicity. So it's kind of like, we want something to happen, but how much do we have to speak? Do we have to yell to get our voices heard? And that kind of seems to be like what it came down to, especially in that case with the racial kind of tensions and issues on the campus.
Yeah, the whole thing with Mizzou is quite interesting, just how it set off a chain reaction. Just I know on college campuses and in protesting and trying to get more rights, and even within the public, just because it kind of correlated with a lot of the issues with communities and police. It was kind of like right at the same time, and I think Mizzou was happening at the same time as Baltimore, or maybe very close. And just kind of how the whole idea of protesting kind of came back together, and because for a while we didn't see, the most we know of recently is Occupy Wall Street as a big style protest. And so, like, to think of a protest as being that effective nowadays, I mean, again, just back to the parent power thing, yes, I have a strong opinion about it, but I also think that's one way for families to get what they want as far as equality for equal education for students. I was just having that discussion actually today with my students as they're starting to develop their public policy, which is their final project in my government class. And, I'm talking about the disparity of school funding between city and suburban schools, or looking at the generational gap between students and teachers, and they're talking about how it needs to change. And I said, well, how are you going to change that? It just doesn't happen by a snap of fingers. You have to do something about it. And it's interesting how a lot of them now are so gun-ho about just jumping into a protest, which is good because maybe we'll actually see some systematic change within education. First thing to do is throw out Common Core. But, I just find it very, very interesting because how you bring up Mizzou and how we can actually connect the two.
And I think something from that video as well that was really important is at the end they said this is just the beginning. The president resigning and having, all of these protests, that can't be it. There needs to be something more. So after all of that kind of contention, you still need to be able to meet together with those people to collaborate to, implement those demands and get things happening, because it's not a one and a done. They said, it's a movement, not a moment. And I think that's with the parent video and with at the different college campuses, that it has to be really seen as a movement that you're going to need to commit time to, not just this one night that I'm going to protest. I'm going to need to go to meetings. I'm going to need to, get more people involved and keep this thing moving.
Right. I think that it's interesting though, because I think some of the situations it's very clear why people would want to protest because of inequalities or inequities, but in other cases it's less clear. I thought it was interesting in reading the campus politics, a cheat sheet, how some of the responses on campus really had nothing to do with like things that happened on campus. It had to do with an incident with the police, and maybe they felt that they didn't have the power to approach the police or that level of authority. So instead, they sort of directed their protests on campus, even though what prompted them to be angry was not necessarily something that happened on campus or was done by anyone on campus. And then I thought that some of the issues that were raised in the new intolerance of student activism, the title of that almost makes it sound like the activism is justified and there's an intolerance of it. But when you read the article and the author's point of view, it seems that that's not what the author's saying at all, because it seems like the author is saying that there's an overreaction here, and they actually refer to the, the argument that too many college students engage in catastrophizing and turning common events into nightmarish trials, or claiming that easily bearable events are too awful to bear. And they actually, talk about making mountains out of molehills and overreacting to what is really innocuous speech. So I thought that created kind of an interesting perspective in terms of how do you know when such a protest or an action is justified, and what process do you personally or does your group go through to really examine that? Because as I was reading this, I was also thinking about what was happening across college campuses in terms of like this idea of trigger warnings. Are you guys, are you familiar with that at all? So
no, I mean, trigger warnings in a different context, yes, but not that.
So what it is, I think some of you may know that my husband is actually a professor at Teachers College at Columbia University, and he was a member of the faculty senate, and they had a lot of conversations about this because students were demanding trigger warnings, which meant that if a professor was going to talk about anything that might upset a student, they needed to notify the student in advance so that the student could opt out. And it was very controversial because people were like, well, how do we know if a student is going to take offense to something? And isn't college about being exposed to a lot of different ideas, whether you agree with them or not? And just to tie into some of our other readings, there was a big case at Princeton University where students were refusing to read the novels assigned because one of the characters was gay in the book, and they said that that was offensive, they didn't believe in that, and that they were going to refuse to read the text. And that was also part of the trigger warnings, is that professors would have to say, like, these are some things that you might find controversial, and you could opt out. And I was thinking about that when I was reading the article about the Halloween email.
It's interesting that you bring up the trigger warnings, because I mean, my first obviously rhetorical question is, when does this get too far? For that professors now have to warn their students as to something that might be offensive. So basically every day there's going to be something that could be offensive, especially if you're in a U.S. history class. Forget it.
Right.
From Reconstruction to today, it's all offensive.
Right.
I mean, I was talking to my students about this today. Again, I mean, I don't know. I relate to them a lot. We have a lot of really good discussions in class, but we're talking about this, the whole idea of, how millennials are kind of pigeonholed as these ultra sensitive, everything has to be sugar-coated generation. And I think that's part of the issue, is that you have so many more people who, because they're what's the word I'm looking for? And I know we're getting a little off target here, but I think it's a valid discussion that, so because of social media and because of so much more information being available to students nowadays, you have many more that want to share their voice, and they want to be equal amongst all, and through the feelings of equality and the drive for equality, we have these issues of like the trigger warnings. But at what point is it now watering down the impact of education? Because of, or maybe I'm wrong, but maybe we do need trigger warnings, but maybe they go too far. I just find it interesting that there's this connection and this stigma out there with the millennial population about that they are the ultra liberal, ultra protesting, and ultra sensitive group.
I think it's really important that, we need to be mindful of everybody, but at some point you can't just not talk about an issue, because that doesn't make it better. I think it's about having open dialogues and being willing to say, here's my opinion, and in a civil manner say, I agree or disagree with that, and here's why, to be able to discuss, so I can gain somebody else's perspective as well. And this is kind of reminding me of the article about the Mexican American Studies program, that they didn't want it because it was going to, create this kind of tension that the students in that class are going to be really resentful of the white students, that they kind of did this, but the teachers and students were like, no, that's not what's happening. So nobody was actually having a dialogue of, what are we learning in this class about our culture as Mexican Americans, and what are we learning in our other history classes, and how are those things related, similar, different? There was no conversation about that. So there was all these assumptions, right? And we all know about assumptions, and without that conversation, we're not making any progress.
Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of, in looking at the Parent Power Viewer Guide, when they were giving suggestions or steps for how to successfully build a coalition. The whole idea of number 3, like appropriately manage the collaboration confrontation dynamic, because I found myself wondering a lot in some of these where we didn't know the whole history or the progression of the protest. Like when I watched the video of the students protesting, that the board was planning to vote to get rid of the MAS program, that seemed really extreme to me, like chaining yourself to the desk, and they wouldn't stop screaming or chanting, and the meeting couldn't take place, and there was no dialogue or discussion. And I found myself wondering, like, had they tried other steps previously as students, and were they not heard or not listened to, or did they go directly to that, that type of protest? I just found myself wondering about that, and also wondering about when I was looking at the Brown University Center and preparation for questions for the guest speaker. They talk about sort of providing training for parents, and I wondered, like, do they take them through those types of steps in terms of like progressions of dialogue and discussion, and then into various types of protest?
Now, I just to kind of jump back on the first one you were talking about with the Mexican American Studies from Cabrera. Find it interesting that you brought it up, how were the students kind of right in the right lane for protesting so hard, or maybe a little bit too hard? Because that opening paragraph, as soon as I started reading it, I knew exactly where it was going. And I saw the name Tom Horn. If you guys aren't familiar with Tom Horn, beyond what he was doing to the Tucson Unified School District, also for the entire state of Arizona, because right around this time I was just leaving Arizona. They were trying to push through legislation to make it so that all instruction in any classroom across the state of Arizona, and maybe it has been passed, I'm not sure since I left, but all instruction in the state of Arizona, regardless of someone's primary language, had to be in English. Basically making it so that English was the only accepted language in the state of Arizona, which is obviously incredibly, in my view, discriminatory and unequal, because let's say you have someone who has just immigrated from, I don't know, Ecuador, let's just say.
Right.
And they're now trying to go to school, and the teacher is only allowed to speak to you in English. That's it.
Right.
So I understand where they're coming from with the protest, because between Horn and Jan Brewer, it was I'm not going to use the word bloodbath, but it was a very interesting time for education in Arizona. I just remember when I was doing my student teaching and all that was coming out, and my mentor teacher kept telling me, this isn't good. This is going to be really bad. This is going to be really bad from a social studies perspective. So I as soon as I read that, I was thinking, okay, I know where this is going as far as, the separation and why, and I see why the steps that Tucson Unified School District took to kind of make sure that they were abiding by the federal law that was the federal statute that was put into play, that they had to desegregate. Yet by removing that could potentially hinder that process.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just, yeah, it may very well have been, you know, the only way they had to stop the vote from happening or to stop the elimination of the program. I may very well have been justified. I just found myself wondering about that because I didn't have a lot of the background. I mean, we did see in the Parent Power video, I forget the chancellor's name, but the chancellor prior to Klein basically listening to them and then saying, yeah, I'm not going to do any of the things that you asked me to do. You know, which is very frustrating. And I know in some of the other videos, you know, they would talk about, or even in the transcripts that we read from the desegregation case in Las Vegas, that the people who have the power would say, all right, you can speak for 30 seconds, and then I'm going to speak for 10 minutes to explain my position, or not even allowing people to speak. And then they have no other choice but to, you know, engage in a hunger strike or something else to get, you know, attention because these other, I guess, less, I don't know what the word is, less stringent or less severe options are not working.
And I think with protests as well, a lot of the focus is on those protesters and kind of watching for them to do something, to like make that mistake or do something so that they can kind of invalidate their whole kind of movement. Like one person in this group of 100 protesters, you know, did something inappropriate or broke the law, and now all of a sudden the whole entire movement is, you know, lawbreakers and this, that, the other. And so I think it's really difficult for that because the system is in place that we're not going to listen. Like you said, the chancellor was like, no, not going to do anything. So then they do have to amp up what they're doing, but then the spotlight's on them and what they're doing, and it kind of goes off of the other issues that I think it's more important that they keep bringing that back to. But how do you manage that? How do you balance, you know, being loud and getting your message out there when people are like, oh, that's annoying. What are you doing? You know?
Right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that they look for some reason to delegitimize the group so that they don't have to listen to the message or respond or make a change. Or actually, yeah. Right. Exactly.
From the system and the power perspective, it's easier just to say, well, you've done this, so I'm not going to meet your demand of X, Y, and Z because you did this other action, than to actually have that discussion and say, you know what, our system or our school is not meeting your needs or is doing something wrong. It's much easier to just invalidate what they're saying.
Right, right. Michelle, did you want to make your comment about the parents? Because then we could all talk about how that relates to our problem of practice.
I was just going to say we should talk about our problem of practice because we're actually running out of time. Shockingly.
Yes. So it was really interesting between the Mexican American Studies program, how the results showed like all these increases at the beginning. And then I think it was 2010 and 2011 that the results didn't really have anything different. And they talked about how they had expanded the program to different schools and that maybe that wasn't implemented with fidelity and kind of issues with that. And they'd also talked about that in the Parent Power video with the lead teacher program that, you know, it did really well in the district and then or the school actually, and then when they spread it to the whole district, then it kind of lost that parent component and it didn't do as well. And so when they tried to scale it up, it lost some of those elements that really made it successful. And that just reminded me of our problems of practice, because right now what we're doing in our research, since we're doing, you know, really small studies right now with really, you know, focus groups, if there is success, what do we want to do with that next? What's going to be, you know, cycle 2 or cycle 3? Are we going to expand what we're doing? And if so, how can we keep it to be the things that, you know, from cycle 1 that were still effective? How can we scale up by still keeping those elements, you know, that made it effective in the first place?
Yeah, I think in terms of my problem of practice, when I think about personal learning, I think because it involves approaching teaching and learning in a very different way, it's critical to involve parents in that process. Sometimes people equate personal learning with blended learning, and they're not necessarily the same thing, although I think you can use blended learning to achieve more personalization. But I know that when we first started using blended learning in New York City, we actually did get some parent complaints because people felt like, hey, you're not teaching anymore, because they weren't standing in the front of the room like lecturing. And because the parents hadn't been engaged from the get-go, they didn't really understand what to expect and how this new approach was going to benefit their students, because the only conceptualization they had of teachers was people standing in the front of the room. And I think the same thing happens like in my district now. Sometimes when you ask students to take more responsibility for their own learning, somehow parents see that as teachers um, like not fulfilling their true responsibilities. They're putting too much on the kids, kind of thing, because they don't really understand, what we're trying to do and why and how it will benefit students. So we have a responsibility to really engage the parents in the process and help them see the benefit in what we're doing so that they support us.
That's actually a great way for me to kind of piggyback off you, because the whole concept of personal learning or individualized learning, whatever you want to call it, it fits right in with the whole flipped classroom environment, and it's kind of like the switch from a teacher being an instructor to more of a facilitator within the classroom environment, because of the differentiation of activities, and which is what I'm looking at with my problem of practice, is the lack of technology that's being used, and the generational gap between students and teachers because of instructional methods remaining the same. But just looking at the whole flipped classroom ideology, if you will, and the facilitation aspect to teachers, instead of standing up in front of the classroom and just lecturing for 45 minutes, which we know goes in one ear and out the other. I can understand parents kind of pushing back to that and saying, well, what's your purpose then? You're basically glorified babysitter then, which I've heard before. But in the same sense, when we look at it, because in order for a student to kind of get to that level 3 of mastery within that topic, they have to be at a certain point and be working hard at home, because a lot of it is pre-work at home for the discussion when we get into the classroom, or for whatever level that they're at. Maybe they don't quite understand the work, and they're doing one activity to get to the other. But there's a lot of actually parent support that's needed, and a lot of work at home that's pre-work to get to that point. So it's a totally different way and a totally different ballgame when it comes to instruction. Yes, I'm not standing up there and blah, 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 because I'm not the end-all, be-all of information, but I can help students point them in the right direction to what they want to learn in terms of the parameters of the class. And that's it's just kind of where I see the two of them kind of linking up. And my mind went blank, and I lost the rest of my thoughts. So
No, you're absolutely right. And it isn't just the parents, it's also the administrators. Because when I worked in New York City, they were using Danielson, but there's also another checklist that they use, and I forget what it's called, but it's like the police, the school police that come out, and they have this checklist. And part of the checklist was looking for the one objective on the board. And when students are working at their own pace, there's like 25 different objectives because kids are all over the place. And they were like marking down the schools because there was no one objective on the board. One time they couldn't find the teacher because the kids were all working and the teacher was engaged, and they couldn't tell the difference between like the students and the teachers, which I was like, that's awesome. And they were like, they're writing on the checklist like fail. I'm like, oh no. So you have to engage like the whole community in what you're doing. Including the administrators.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. Luckily, my administrators are awesome, but they still use Danielson, the city. I don't know why. It was never made to be an assessment tool. I digress from that point. I could go on and on about that in Common Core and whatever. But no, you're right, though, because saying, oh, well, where's the teacher? Well, that's great. But like you're saying, that's one-to-one conferencing, which is what we talk about all the time. And having more student to teacher feedback discussion and knowing your students, and this whole new thing with the city about families being involved. The reintroduction of families into the learning environment, and having the students, the families, and the teacher, and the administrators in the school all together as one. Well, the only way you do that is if you have that relationship with the student. You don't do it any other way. That's just my opinion with it. that's why when I look at my problem of practice and this whole idea of technology infused instruction and trying to close that generational gap between traditional instruction, which I went through, and my students are going through the same style now, which is a problem. How can we move it forward? And one way that I've identified this is through that whole flipped learning environment, because it's a relatively new idea and a new concept to engage them in their learning. And I'm going to say we should probably wrap it up, because I think we're actually over 30 minutes.
This just keeps reminding me, if anybody watched Sunday Night Football, you probably heard "so what, now what" like a million times during the game. And I think that applies, in a lot of situations in education. Like, this is where we're at, so now what are we going to do about it?
Right.
What's the pathway that we get to somewhere better?
I like that. That's a great way to end.
Yeah.
You guys have anything else you want to add? No?
No, I don't want to keep us any longer.
All right. Well, I'm going to go watch the Jets and Cardinals. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night.